Today I'm talking about a recently completed study by our team titled The Effect of Odor Training Paradigm on Acquisition and Generalization Across Explosives. We're going to be talking about how do we do initial odor training or initial odor imprinting on a green dog, and if the way that we present different odors has an impact on acquisition, or in other words learning speed, or generalization across different explosives types. So first we're going to talk about generalization. Generalization is basically how do you respond similarly or in a similar way to different stimuli. So all two of any kind of stimuli are ultimately different to some degree, but a lot of times the differences are going to be so subtle that we would respond as though they're the same. So for example, if you were in the grocery store and I pointed and I said, what is this? You might say orange. And then if I pointed to this one and I say, what is this? You might say orange. And just now I'm sounding like a 3-year-old, but then I say, what is this? And you might also say orange. And what is this? And you might say orange. That all of these all sort of encompass the category of orange. Now, a question of generalization might come up. Is say, for example, I'm asking you to point out all of the oranges, and you come across this stimuli. Would this stimulus also trigger you to say orange? Is this also orange? Some of you might say yes because of the color, other you might say no because it's not an actual fruit of the orange per se. So then we could say you might discriminate, or you might not respond by saying that this is orange, or you might generalize by saying yes, this is orange. So we're going to be talking about this phenomenon with respect to explosives today. So for example, if I give you one version of C4, but then I have C4 from a different manufacturer or a different source, do you respond the same to both of those two varieties? Or do you say, no, they're different, like this orange is from this pumpkin? So what is the impact on how we imprint different kinds of odors? In other words, if I have a set of a bunch of odors that I'm going to train, or a certain standard set of odors, does it matter whether I give them one at a time, or whether I mix them together, or whether I train the dog on all of them at the exact same time? Does that make any difference on, one, how long it takes the dogs to learn the task? So do they acquire or learn the task faster one way or another? And then are they better at generalizing across varieties of one explosive versus another? In other words, if I train them one way versus another, are they more likely to respond to different varieties of C4, or different varieties of det cord, or different varieties of TNT packaged in different ways if they were imprinted with one method versus another? And that's a fundamental question that we will be answering today. Now I want you to pretend that you're an alien that's come to Earth for the very first time, and I'm going to guide you through all of your questions about the plants and animals of Earth. And before you think, I've totally lost the plot, just follow along with me for the next minute or two. And if you still think I've lost the plot by then go ahead and you can stop listening. But give me a minute just to try and explain myself, to try and sort of conceptualize what we're talking about with relevant generalization discrimination issues. So you're the alien, you've come to Earth for the very first time, and you have a variety of questions about different kinds of animals. I can teach you different kinds of animals into different categories, whether they are, say, birds or non-birds. So let's say, for example, your job is to find all of the birds on Earth, and that is what you have been sent to do. Just like you might be a detection dog to find all the different explosives that might be out there on Earth. So you're sent to find all of the birds. I can teach you in a couple different ways. The first way might be sequential. In the sequential method, I'll present a single exemplar, a single example, like take, for example, a picture of this bird. Whenever you see this bird, I'll teach you to label it that this counts as a bird. This is a target stimulus, this is a bird. And over here is we just have a simple graph of performance, and I have odor here, but just think of this as a bird. So when I give you a session for one trial, I say this is a bird. At first you have no sort of particular likelihood of saying that correctly that this is a bird, but then very quickly you jump up in performance and I show you this picture and you say it's a bird, and I give you another trial and you have a 50% probability of saying it's a bird, but eventually your success picks up and it gets and reaches to 100%. But during this method, the entire time I'm just simply presenting one single example or one single picture. So for our detection dogs, this would be like taking one single odor, say smokeless powder, and I am exclusively training with that specific odor until you meet your criterion of, say, 100% accuracy. Now that I've reached perfect accuracy on the first bird, I can change to another bird, and now I want to add a new example or a new exemplar of a bird to your vocabulary. So now I come down here and start with my new one. And now I'm at session 11 and I start training you with this new bird. And every time you see this bird, I'm teaching you to label that as a bird until you eventually reach criterion all the way back up to 100%. But we're completely ignoring and not going back to the previous bird. We've finished with that one, right? So we've already met criterion on this one. So now we forget about that one and move on to the next one and teach the next one until we reach criterion. So that sequential method is going to repeatedly present that same picture, in this case of a bird, or that same target odor until you've sort of reached all of the training that you want with that odor. And then once that's complete, we go on to the next one. In contrast, a mixture training is going to be more of like what you might call the stew method. So in this case, we're going to present all of the different examples that we might want to teach the animal. So in this case, could be multiple varieties of an explosive, or in the case of the birds, multiple pictures of the bird, but it's all kind of jumbled up and mixed together to present all of them at the same time as one complex either odor mixture or one complex picture mixture. So this picture mixture might end up being this kind of jumbled mix here where we're, from an odor perspective, this is kind of what we're doing. We're smushing together the different kinds of odor sources and then mixing them all up together so that they're all presented as one singular stimulus that is a mixture of all of the other individual stimuli that we're interested in. So this is a mix-up of 4 different bird pictures being essentially blended up together and being presented as one. So this would be the same as taking the odor that is coming off of multiple kinds of explosives and mixing that sort of odor together and then presenting that to the animal. And that was the mixture group. So this mixture group would, again, be quite similar to what we saw with the sequential, but we're training all of them in one go. So this is like just training one singular odor, but now this odor as one singular entity has all of the different components that we might expect to include of, say, birds here, but of different explosives that we might want to train the dog towards. Now we can contrast this to an intermix method. So instead of mixing all together the head spaces and making a complex singular odor mixture, is that we can start from scratch, not just by training you exclusively to just this one example of a bird until you've met that perfectly and you've gotten all of the way that we want you to say bird in the presence of this odor or of this picture done. But rather we give you all of the different examples that we might want you to learn, and not at the same time as a singular mixture, but all a part of that initial training component. So when you change up from one trial to the next trial, you're changing up the different pictures and the different stimuli. So instead of waiting until you have mastered just this picture before presenting the next picture, I give you one trial with this picture and let you know that this is a bird. And then I'll go ahead and throw in this picture and let you know that it's a bird, and throw in this picture and let you know that it's a bird. So that we keep interchanging between these different pictures all from the get-go so that all of these become classified ideally in a similar kind of concept of bird. So from an odor perspective, or what this might look like on a graph, as we start in session 1, you have difficulty in identifying any of these as a bird because you're first learning them. But then perhaps one of them is a little bit easier, so you pick that one up and you ultimately reach 100%. But you're also getting some trials with some of these other birds, and you're picking that one up a little bit, maybe a little bit slower. And then maybe another one is a little bit harder, but you're getting trials with all of these different birds, all throughout the same time. So you're never just being taught exclusively that just this picture is a bird or just this picture is a bird, but rather that each of these is considered a bird and they keep appearing in your training in an intermixed method, meaning that it's randomly coming up whether you're going to be given this picture or that picture or this picture, and we keep going until you reach your criterion on all of them together at the very end. And then ultimately, the big question is how do you then generalize to novel variations of those birds, right? Because we're going to come across novel variations of explosives that we need our dogs to find, like a different version of C4, a different version of an RDX-based explosive, a different version of a PTM-based explosive, etc. So here I have an ostrich as a different version or variety of the bird, and an owl as another variety of the bird that you haven't seen. And would you be more likely to say this is a bird and this is a bird based off of the different experiences that I gave you in that initial training? Whether you learned sequentially, whether you learned in that mixture method, or whether you learned in that intermixed method. So that was the question that we were trying to answer. And this is how we ultimately did it. So we did it two separate studies. I'm going to talk about the first study now, and then we're going to go into the second study. This first study looked at what we call across different explosive categories. In other words, we had an explosive category of our sort of plastics RDX-based explosives. We had a category of our TNT-based explosives. We had a category of sort of our fertilizer, fuel oxidizer kind of explosives. Then we had our det cords, detonation core PTM-based types of explosives. So we were training our dogs to all four of these different kinds of explosive categories. And then we also had a variant of each of these categories. So for C4, their variant was PE4. For TNT, their variant was French Flake TNT. For AN, their variety was CAN26, which is a fertilizer type of ammonium nitrate. And then for det cord, we had C2 sheet explosive as their variant. So for our mixture dogs, to train this as a mixture, we basically mixed the head spaces. So we were using sort of one of what we call an olfactometer, basically a tool that is able to present the odor in an automated fashion to the dog. That was making the odor mixture for us. So it was equally mixing the odor that was coming off of the AN, the TNT, the det cord, and the C4, mixing that together and presenting that as the odor for the dog to be trained on. So now that the dogs were trained to proficiency on the mixture, we wanted to know if we were to then test them as separate odors and then test the other variants that we had also been interested in of each of our main target ones, would they spontaneously respond to each of these individual components, the ones that were in the mixture, as well as additional components that were related to the ones that were in the mixture? Would they spontaneously generalize to them? Or would we actually, after we have done the mixture, have to train each one of them individually? Or do we only have to train a subset of them individually? Does it facilitate time because maybe they get 3 out of the 4 in just one training go? So we did a generalization test where we present these odors in what we call non-reinforced probes, meaning that we didn't reinforce them if they made a correct response on this because we didn't want to then be sort of training these new odors. But what we did is we built an intermittent schedule of reinforcement before we did the test, meaning that the dogs were aware that they didn't get reinforced every time they made a correct response. So then we would kind of throw these trials in, sprinkled randomly throughout the session, and say, hey, would you respond to a det cord? And then if they responded, or if they didn't respond, there was the same outcome, the trial just ended. So we did it for all of these different variations to see, would you respond to this one, this one, this one, this one, etc. So we'll say, for example, which actually happened for the majority of the dogs, is that they responded to C4 and they correctly responded to C4. We would then consider that to be a trained odor for them, and then we would then sequentially train them to all of the other components that they missed. So one of the most common outcomes that we'll discuss when we got to the results is that the dogs would only show proficiency in detection of C4, but not for the other individual components. So then what we would do is we would break out each of those individual components, train that sequentially until they met TNT, and det cord, and then the other variants until they completed and met criterion on all 8 of those odors. So our measure of learning speed or total acquisition was when did you get to that final outcome of all 8 odors. So then we would do supplemental training for TNT. Once the dog met criterion for TNT, we would then do our generalization assessment for all of the things remaining. You can notice that C4 is not here anymore because they had already met criterion, so we kind of popped that one out. Then we did TNT, measured generalization to all of them. And then say, for example, they spontaneously generalized to TNT and French flake. We would then consider that these 2 odors are then trained. And then we would move on to the next odor in their list, which would be AN, train them on that one. And we would consider C4, TNT, French flake to all be trained. Train them until reaching criterion on that, and then go back to our generalization test. So we had this cycle of train, test for generalization, train, test for generalization, because we wanted to get at the point as, well, maybe after we've trained these number of odors, we don't actually have to train these other ones because we're getting great generalization that becomes unnecessary and will save us a lot of time. So we were constantly doing train this odor, test for generalization to see which ones actually needed to be trained and which ones would come along spontaneously through generalization, and would one training paradigm produce more generalization that would save us more time in the long run is what we were looking at. So our sequential group was quite similar, but instead of starting with that mixed component, right, all those little bird pieces kind of all coming together, we just trained them directly to the C4. Then we did our generalization test to all of them. And then say, for example, they responded just to C4. We would then pop that one out, start with the next one, train them to that one to proficiency, go back to our generalization test, and start all over again. And we would continue that all through the various odors. Next, when we get to the intermixed paradigm, we would actually train all of our initial 4 primary odors at the same time. But instead of presenting them in one single mix where we mix the odor from all 4 of these materials together and present that to the dog, we would have one trial of AN, a trial of C4, a trial of Detcord, a trial of TNT. We'd have little blocks of it, say you get 3 AN, 3 C4, 3 TNT, 3 Detcord, 3 TNT, 3 C4, 3 AN. But all within the session, the dog would see all of these instead of having them going one after another like we do in the sequential. So we have individual odors, but all of them are appearing from the very get-go of training rather than training all the way on one and then moving to the next. So all the dogs would be trained until they met criterion on these initial 4 odors. Then we would do our generalization test and see maybe if we train them on all of these 4 odors, generalization would be so great that they would then spontaneously respond to all of them. So once we've trained to the 4, all 8 were good. So in practice, that's not what typically happened, actually. This is more what was typical, is that you would get good generalization to all of the ones that you trained, which is what we would expect because we explicitly trained them. And then we might get 1 or 2 additional odors that would be learned spontaneously without having to be explicitly trained. So then how would we do supplemental training? Is that we would take the next odor in the list, so in this case would be PE4, and we basically would keep all of these other odors in here, but then we would substitute PE4 for the C4 that they had passed. Then train the dogs on PE4 until reaching criterion in this intermixed fashion, go back to generalization, then whichever ones that were left, we would then sort of substitute out their other training primary variant for that. So this perhaps slowed down maybe some of the intermixed dogs because we did this, but we wanted to try and keep it as apples to apples comparisons across the way that we did it for the other 2 groups to make sure that we weren't giving one group an unfair advantage versus another. So what were the results? Perhaps you have a prediction on what these results might be. You can see if you're right or wrong, but we'll see what we happen. So the first thing that we wanted to look at is, were some odors harder than another? So interestingly enough, despite the fact that we train dogs to all these different types of target materials, there's actually very little out in the literature that suggests that one odor is more difficult than another, because we just really haven't tested it. So we basically took all of our training data. So some of these values are 75 to 80%, because we're looking at all the way from the beginning of training all the way through the end of training. So there was a lot of kind of in between. So we wanted to try and capture this variance so we could see which odors were the dogs have absolutely no problem on, even at the beginning, to which ones took a little bit longer until they reached their proficiency criterion, which, by the way, was 90% if I haven't previously specified. So what we found is that the mixture target was really easy for the dogs to respond to. It was about as easy as C4, as well as easy as C2 sheet, and then det cord, French flake TENT, untagged PE4, CAN 26 as sort of the ammonium nitrate sort of based fertilizer, ammonium nitrate itself, and then the hardest one was our TNT based explosives. Those required the most training time overall for the dogs. So this just gives us which explosives were more difficult than others, and you can see that there's quite a substantial variation in them, ranging from C4 and C2 being your nice easy ones, det cord being relatively easy, to some of your TNT being some of the most difficult. But interestingly enough, things like French flake TNT weren't as difficult, but this might have been partially because this was trained after the dogs had already been trained to TNT. Now you might be wondering, well, what about the mixture group? When we trained the dogs to the mixture, did they find each of those individual components in that generalization test? And this was the result of that. So this is the probability of alert. So 100 meaning they alerted on every trial, 0 meaning they alerted on 0 trials. So if they met criterion of 90% plus accuracy on detecting the mixture, they were about 70% probability of responding to C4. They had around a 30% probability of responding to det cord. They had around a 12 to 15% probability of responding to AN, and nobody responded to TNT. So essentially that mixture predominantly generated stimulus control on C4, a little bit on det cord, maybe a tiny bit on AN, and literally 0 on TNT. So what about acquisition time? In other words, did one group of dogs learn to reach all 8 of our training odors faster than another? And the answer was nope, there was no difference whatsoever. Overall, statistically, each group was likely to complete at about the same amount of training sessions as the other groups. So the mixture didn't actually end up saving any time over going sequentially. Intermix didn't save any time going the others. It also didn't cause any delays in total training time. So in reality, it was kind of all paths led to the same total time and total training. That led us to the sort of bigger question of, well, what about generalization across a variety of variants? So we had those 8 that we trained to, and then we had and acquired an additional 14 different variations of the explosives of the 4 primary explosive categories that we had trained to, and we wanted to know, well, would one training paradigm lead to greater generalization across this broader range of different kinds of explosives? So here are the main results from the perspective of sniff time. So remember, we were using our olfactometers, which were basically boxes that are able to present the odor but also measure how long the dog holds their nose in the odor port. So sniff time is just a measure here in milliseconds of how long they held their nose in the odor port. They were trained for 4,000 milliseconds or 4 seconds, so it was a focus 4,000 millisecond or 4-second nose hold. And we have sort of our C4 varieties, our det cord varieties, our PETM based, our TNT varieties, and our ammonium nitrate varieties. So the one, or the sort of odor to the left here of this dashed line, and each of these is the trained odor. So this was a performance for an odor that we explicitly trained the dogs to. And you can see that they all held their nose regardless of group for the 4,000 milliseconds or 4-second nose hold time. And then here are all of our variants, and you can see that we got a pretty substantial drop off for a lot of them. Our dashed axes here is basically how long would they hold their nose for a distractor odor. So if we got something like here, you can see that this is well above what they would hold their nose for a distractor. So they were detecting it, but not enough to give a full commit to actually make it the same as one of their targets. So this is what we sort of call our generalization decrement. This is what they were trained to find. This is a variety of that, and the difference between here and here is the decrement. And what you can see is this decrement is overall less for our intermixed group than it is in comparison to our mixture and our sequential. But the sequential dogs were holding for about the same amount of time as if they were as a distractor. So they were not recognizing this as actually being similar to a target. Our mixture group was somewhat on the fence, and our intermix group here was showing that they were recognized as being different than a distractor, so not the same as just a novel distractor, but also not quite the same as their actual target. So this is one of those where definitely we're not seeing proficiency in this generalization between, say, the intermix, mixture, and sequential group, but we are seeing a change of behavior here, right? They're holding for a whole 2 seconds. So this means perhaps that if you were training this, or you were to come across this, you might be able to quickly train this because they're already giving you a 2-second hold, something for you to easily shape to bring it up to something to your duration of 4 seconds, or if you were doing a sit, perhaps this would be something looking like they're thinking about sitting, etc. So we could get this for a variety of probes for our C4s. We can see a similar kind of trend for our det cords, but almost lower generalization for a lot of these varieties. For the TNT variants, we saw the highest levels of generalization, particularly for the intermix group. So we saw decent generalization here. For this version, this variety, where we got somewhat lower amounts for our other 2 groups. And then again, more for the AN as well in comparison to our other groups. Although some of these, the individual differences between all of these can statistically might not sort of map out for each of them. But overall, we did see a difference in which intermix tended to generalize slightly more by showing a whole longer sniff time for the untrained varieties in the intermix group in comparison to our mixture and our sequential groups. And then this also highlights the importance that this intermix group is not essentially resolving any generalization decrements to the point in which the dog is reaching proficiency, which we would define proficiency sort of up here, but it is getting you, almost halfway there in some of the cases, more so than in our other groups, particularly for closer to our TNTs. So for example, in this case, we are getting close to proficiency for this variety of TNT in comparison, where we're not seeing that for our mixture or our sequential group. So again, we're seeing these kinds of improvements in terms of generalization, but we're not seeing them to a level of which we would say is resolving any generalization decrements, and they're making the dogs sort of proficient to these varieties of which they have not seen previously. We also did a wide variety of chemical analyses of all of these different explosives at the same time. And we wanted to see, were there any particular chemicals that we could pull out that seemed to be important, that were related or predictive to the dog's performance. And interestingly, the answer is there was not a super clear pattern. There were some kind of associations in there that were of interest, but not this VOC seems to be related to the dog's performance. But one trend that we saw is that in a lot of the situations of where our dogs would respond really quite well to one target, but then not to another target, so the dogs responded well to this target and they didn't respond that well to this target, is that they would contain a lot of the same key molecules that we typically associate with C4 plastic explosives. But what was unique about the one that the dogs performed poorly on, or they didn't respond to, is that a lot of times there would be a molecule that was unique to the thing that they responded poorly on. In other words, something that kind of was in this version that was different than all the others. So it was an addition that seemed to be throwing the dogs off. Not that it was missing like a key chemical that's related to C4. Those were there, but it also had something else that wasn't in their regular training. And that's what seemed to be throwing the dogs off more than it's missing a particular chemical that was associated with C4. Again, these results are still relatively tentative, but it was something that was kind of interesting that really suggested an area to explore further, but highlights that the addition of some type of chemical might be something that is important to this overall generalization, rather than does it have the specific C4 volatiles associated with it. So that was basically the main takeaways from our what we call between classes explosives. So using our ammonium nitrate, our TNT, our C4, and our det cords. We also wanted to know as well, what if we focused our study onto one specific class of explosives? In this case, smokeless powders. So our mixture, remember when I was kind of cutting up that bird in all different ways, didn't work so well. But what if I was cutting up just one cardinal and then repasting it back together from different cardinals? In other words, I was keeping in the same category or of relatively similar types of explosives. Would the mixture do better there? Alternatively, would the intermix do better there? Or would the sequential be perfectly fine in that situation? So here we did the exact same study, but we were focused specifically on variations of smokeless powders. For those of you who know, there's a variety of different smokeless powders that you can get: single base, double base. There's triple base, but very rarely do you come into contact with those kinds of things. So we bought a variety of different types of single bases and double bases of different manufacturers for a total of 18 different smokeless powders. And then we did a similar kind of study where the dogs were trained to 8 different varieties of them. So here we have, this is double base, DB for double base, SB for single base, and then the brand variety ACC, and then the specific version 2200. So this is looking at, in our training data, was one brand or is one type better than another? So we have double base ACC 220, double base ACC 1680, the double base HCFE 223, the HUS 869. These were all very, very easy for the dogs to acquire. We did have a couple that the dogs did seem to have a bit of difficulty with. So these were from a European manufacturer. VVN 530 was a little bit more difficult. The single base from Accurate was a little bit more difficult. And then ultimately the hardest one was the single base from the European manufacturer, specifically the 165 variety the dog struggled with the most. In terms of, did the different training paradigms lead to the dogs being able to acquire 8 different versions of the smokeless powder better than another? And the answer was no. Overall, just like what we saw with the across explosive study, dogs didn't learn the 8 varieties faster one way or another, so you got to the same end goal at the exact same time. So then the question becomes, was generalization any different between the way that you taught them or trained them? And the answer in this case was, again, yes. The intermixed group tended to respond with a higher probability of an alert and a longer nose hold time than did the dogs that were trained in the mixture or in the sequential method. So this is our primary 4 trained varieties. You'll see that it's actually 3 in this case, because that VVN 165, several of the dogs actually had substantial problems with it that we ended up not including that in some of the training. But of the remaining sort of primary odors that they were trained to, all the groups responded basically as equally well, a similar 4-second nose hold across the board for all of them. And then these were the various sort of probe or varieties that we tested that the dogs were not explicitly trained to. So we had a total of 10 of them. And you can see that these red bars are the intermix. These dogs tended to hold their nose longer, as well as have a higher probability of response in comparison to the other groups across a wide variety of variations. And again, like what we saw with the explosives, this dashed line is how long they would hold their nose to distractors. This dashed line was the false alarm rate, or overall false alarm rate to novel odors. So you can see for a lot of them, they were all recognizing them as being something more than just a novel distractor, that it was related to their target, but we had a pretty substantial sort of variation between different types of smokeless powders, from this one being one of our most difficult ones, or single base H4350, where we had others that essentially they responded to really quite well, like some of our double bases from ACC 2495. But ultimately, again, even though the intermix was facilitating generalization and you're getting longer nose hold times that might make it easier for training, you weren't getting what we'd say, overall proficiency, meaning that you weren't reaching that 90% or 100% level on a lot of these varieties spontaneously, suggesting that the intermix training is helping and increasing that generalization, but it's not giving you that full proficiency level, meaning that you can't train in an intermixed way and then just say generalization is resolved. You still have to train to as many examples or exemplars as possible, or explicitly in this case, but the intermix is helping give you that 2.5 close to 3-second, that substantial change in behavior related to these varieties that you weren't getting with some of our sequential or mixture trained dogs. This is an interesting graph because we wanted to know, well, how much of this variation in that generalization that we were seeing was ultimately related to the VOC profile of these different types of smokeless powders. So the way that we chose all of these different types of smokeless powders is we did sort of an analytical chemistry analysis using GC mass spec, where we basically pulled all the different chemicals that were coming off of all the different volatiles. And we did a statistical sort of analysis, which is called principal component analysis, which you see here, which is basically a way to kind of plot how far away are different odors. So you can read this kind of like if you were reading a map. So odor 10 is really far away from odor 16 in terms of the chemical properties associated with it. But odor 12 and odor 18 and odor 17 are actually really similar in terms of their statistical properties related to each other. So we wanted to know, well, is that sort of statistical relationship or overlap of a lot of these chemicals, is that what was predicting the overall performance? Because we tried to identify our 4 main components by selecting things as far apart as each other. So we were trying to cover and capture that whole space, all of that odor space in one go, because we tried to capture as much of that variety as possible. And what we found is that this underlying odor relationship to each other actually had very little prediction of what the dogs would do. So this is their overall accuracy. So this number 12, we have dogs that were near 100% accuracy in detecting this odor, but this odor, they were responding at around 30 to 40%. We would have other odors like this 3 right here, where the dogs were at 100%, but then they could barely detect this odor. They might show more response to this odor, so you have one odor that they show good response to, one odor they show moderate response to, and in between that is an odor that they show almost no response to. So in other words, what we found is that our ability to just take that chemical data and then see which odors are related to each other and use that to understand what a dog would spontaneously generalize to or not wasn't actually mapping up particularly well, which means that the underlying system was even more complicated than what we were anticipating. But sort of what we found previously when we were talking about the across explosives is that we did find that there would be a couple of chemicals, interestingly enough, that would be in high concentration in the odors that, or in the varieties of smokeless powder that the dogs didn't respond particularly well for. So this was a type of statistical analysis that helped us try to identify and predict which were the components that seemed to be most important related to whether a dog would respond or not. And interestingly, some of these molecules that were associated with, say, some of these VVN varieties seemed to actually be predictive of poor responding. So it was the, again, addition of these particular molecules that appear in some of these single bases of some of these other brands that actually were leading to the decrement in that generalization. So again, the chemistry data does seem to sort of relate to performance, but it's not in a simple way that just saying these that are statistically related to each other are going to smell the same. There's a lot more complexity and nuance that is associated with that. But perhaps, if as we advance our research, we might be able to identify what are the specific sort of combinations of the things that are related to how the dog is perceiving these odors that might be ultimately important in predicting whether they would respond or not respond, so that we can address specifically what are the types of smokeless powders that need training towards. So again, just like what we saw with the C4 situation, is that we could have some odors with the highest response rate, some with the lowest response rate, and they would have the same chemical signature that we typically think of as being an odor signature for smokeless powder. That would be present in both. But what seemed to be distinguishing the highest responding versus the lowest responding is the addition of random kind of chemicals that were being sort of additional contaminants to it that was then causing that sort of low generalization. So it seems to not necessarily be does this variety not have something that makes it smell like smokeless powder. It has that, but it also has something else that's then making it smell not quite like their trained smokeless powder. So again, that intermixing can help in sort of facilitating that, get you those 2 to 3 second sort of focus, change of behaviors, but ultimately having those reinforced examples and training on that seem to be what's important to get to that proficiency level. But that intermixing overall got you a little bit further just by changing the way that that paradigm occurred in comparison to sequential training or mixture training. So the overall take-home points of this is that all the dogs sort of reached all 8 training odors in both experiments at the same time. So we didn't really have a training effect or a training paradigm effect on acquisition or learning speed. Our mixture training did not produce responding to all components. So particularly with our cross explosives, we really only got primarily responding to C4, a little bit to det cord. With our smokeless powders, the dogs responded to 3 out of the 4 smokeless powders in the mixture, so it was slightly better with our smokeless powders, but ultimately, even then, they didn't reach the final any faster than did our dogs in either the intermix or the sequential groups, so it didn't speed up training in that respect, and it also didn't produce better generalization. The better generalization came from that intermix training. So intermix training led to greater generalization, but it didn't lead to proficiency. In other words, you can't just intermix train these 4 odors and now the dogs will find all 14 varieties, no problem. They would be better or have a higher probability or a greater change of behavior as we measured by that sniff time. They would hold their nose a little bit longer than they would to any normal distractor, which you would then have to be sensitive to, but explicit training was still going to be needed to get that 90% accuracy higher with that trained final response. But our suggestion is that perhaps that might be a little bit easier if you have a dog that's already giving you that change in 2 seconds, in 3 seconds versus that half second, 1 second, etc. So take-home points: the way that these odors are exposed during early and initial training can be important. It didn't really seem to make any difference in terms of time or overall training time, but it did seem to make a bit of important difference in terms of generalization. Thank you very much.